Hi guys, my name is Emily. Welcome to my Dark Tower reading project. This is a video series in which I record my thoughts on Stephen King's Dark Tower series and try and make sense of the series in terms of my research interest in fantasy literature. So two disclaimers, one being that this is my first time reading the series. I have no idea where this is going, so if I say something or if I make a prediction that doesn't make sense based on your knowledge of having read the whole series, that's why. Second disclaimer is that I do not care about authorial intentions. I have a video explaining that. I will leave it linked down below. I am interested in the text as it stands alone. I am interested in how it fits in with the fantasy genre. How does it engage with the genre? How does it subvert the genre? All of these things. I am interested more so in that than what the author's notes say this series is about, or imposing a biographical reading upon the text. And because of that approach, I am reading some of the works that I think influence the text. Today I'm talking about Wizard and Glass, which is the fourth book, and The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Normally I do a separate video talking about the extra text. I don't have that much to say on The Wizard of Oz. I didn't particularly enjoy it. It was never one of my favorite films as a kid, and I'd never read the book as a kid, and I didn't particularly love it now, just as a reading experience. But I can appreciate what the book does and what the book sort of does in terms of King's text. The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum was first published in 1900, and it is considered by the Library of Congress to be one of the first American fairy tales. I can definitely see the influence of the Grimm brothers and Hans Christian Andersen in this fairy tale. Apparently, for those living in America, there are a lot of national sites that are recreated in sort of a fairy tale fantastical way. Apparently, the Emerald City is inspired by a building in Holland, Michigan, and Peekskill, New York actually had a yellow paved road. So we can definitely see Baum drawing in elements of America into this somewhat traditional fairy tale. Like, we have the quest, we have the magic, we have the repetition of threes. It also sort of reads as a more coherent version of Alice in Wonderland. Alice is sort of like nonsense children's literature. It's not meant to be didactic. You just have Alice fall into this nonsense space and nonsense happens. Whereas in The Wizard of Oz, you have Dorothy fall through into this other world, but there is a lot more order. There's still wonder, but there's a lot more order and logic. And so with The Wizard of Oz, we really do see the combination of sort of quintessentially American things and the fantastic. So we have scarecrows, which are, you know, farming things, very American, I guess. And then we have those scarecrows become animated and talking. So it's a really neat blend. It definitely reads as a fairy tale, which is part of the reason I didn't enjoy it, because it's a lot longer than a lot of the fairy tales. And so when you have things happening in threes all the time, it's no big deal. It's just like, this person went and did the thing, and this person went and did the same thing, and this person went and did the same thing. I can see how it's important, and I can see how when we link it to the Dark Tower series, and when we think about the Dark Tower series as sort of a American fantasy novel in just the settings, like we have our fantasy heroes walk into a version of Kansas in which a plague has struck, the plague in the stand actually. We have America become a fantasy setting. It's not the generic woods. It's not something that feels very European, the way in which many fairy tales and fantasies do. Like a lot of fantasy literature, the staples of fantasy literature and fairy tales, which is sort of a branch of fantasy literature, come from Europe. So they have a very European feel in terms of setting and world order and stuff like that. Whereas when you read Wizard and Glass, when you read the Dark Tower series, you're seeing an attempt at creating a very American feeling fantasy. I feel like it's so appropriate for Dark Tower to be influenced by the first American fairy tale. If we're looking at one of the first American high fantasy novels, then it makes sense that it would align itself with its predecessor, like its genre predecessor, right? At the same time that the Dark Tower series is shaping up to be an American fantasy, it definitely acknowledges the roots of the genre, I think, in terms of the series villain. The Man in Black / the Crimson King / Randall Flagg / he has so many names. What else do we call him in here? / Martin / Merlin. Obviously, this sorcerer is linked to so many figures, and I think in terms of his iconography, the eye symbol that he uses, he's linked to the Lord of the Rings. He's linked to Tolkien's antagonist Sauron. Sauron is a necromancer. The Man in Black, Martin, Randall Flagg, etc. is also a sorcerer. In Tolkien's The Silmarillion, it's indicated that Sauron can change his appearance at will, and we know that Randall Flagg, if you've read The Stand, Randall Flagg can sort of shift how he appears. Sauron is referred to as the Red Eye, the Evil Eye, the Lidless Eye, the Great Eye. People aren't really allowed to use Sauron's name. He has all these stand-ins, and I feel like we're not really calling the sorcerer by his name when he has so many of them. Martin, Merlin, Randall Flagg, the Crimson King, whatever you want to call him. Like, there's a disassociation. Like, you can't use his true name because names are powerful. And speaking of names being powerful, we see that Susanna Dean, a current member of Roland's Quartet, is sharing initials with Susan Delgado, Roland's childhood love interest, I guess teenage love interest. We know that Susanna is pregnant, and then we see that Susan Delgado is pregnant and dies. I'm worried for Susanna Dean. I really love her as a character, but I mean, I think there's a pretty strong parallel there between the two characters and potentially their fates by the end of the series. So the other thing that I'm wondering about with the doubling of names is that Roland's father is Stephen. So we have, like, in the fantastic secondary world, we have Stephen literally fathering Roland, like, as a human reproduces, but the fact that Stephen King, the author, is also a father in a way to Roland, and that he created Roland in his mind. He developed a human, he developed a fictional human, and gave that fictional human life. The one thing that I think is sort of interesting is the overlaps with The Stand by Stephen King. Many of you sort of balked at the fact that I didn't include a lot of Stephen King's texts. Apparently, there are many texts that overlap with the Dark Tower series just throughout his career. He sort of dips and blurs and overlaps, and Randall Flagg is one of those characters that appears in both The Stand, which is set in a not fantastical world. It's a world in which biological warfare ends up wiping out most of the population, and it's sort of a survival story. Randall Flagg is still sort of a supernatural figure in that, but I wouldn't say that The Stand is a fantasy novel in the way that the Dark Tower series is a fantasy series. Like, I can see why people wanted me to include it, but it doesn't so much as influence this series as just provide you with extra knowledge. Like, if you've read The Stand, you know who that, like, cryptic message about going to Abigail stuffed in the windshield is, and you have a little more context, but I don't think it's necessary to seeing what influenced this text. But it is interesting to think about the line, quote, "Go then, there are other words than these," on page 115. The idea that the plague that happens in The Stand doesn't happen in Eddie's version of the world. Eddie comes from a plagueless world in 1987, and the dates that they find on the newspaper in that version of Kansas they're in, talking about the plague, are from 1986. So there are different worlds, it's quote, "the world next door," end quote, and that's from page 147 in my book. So the idea that these worlds are sort of parallel and slightly overlapping, but different things, like different parallel worlds, it's interesting. I guess the last thing I want to say is connecting to The Wizard of Oz. There's that whole scene at the conclusion of the novel in which the Quartet basically recreates the meeting of the Wizard of Oz. Like, literally, there's somebody there calling himself the Wizard of Oz, and it's Martin, the Man in Black, Randall Flagg, influencing the TikTok man behind the curtain. It's just kind of a repeat of the scene. Everybody gets ruby slippers, which is movie Wizard of Oz, opposed to book Wizard of Oz, where they get silver slippers, which is, again, why I think maybe I should have watched the movie rather than read the book, because I feel like it really draws more on the film, and it was interesting to see Roland's Cait explain the narrative of The Wizard of Oz to Roland, and then to have them literally live through The Wizard of Oz. So this kind of like real fictionalized experience. I don't know how to make that work in my brain, but hopefully it's coming across. They experienced fiction, or they experienced a real moment that mirrors fiction, but they are fictional characters to us. I'm definitely curious to see where this series goes. I'm a little worried about it getting super meta. Like, I think the series is still doing a really decent job of connecting with and subverting fantasy genre elements. I think the series still sees the fantasy roots. It's still playing with the fantasy roots, like definitely connecting to fantasy genre staple Lord of the Rings, connecting to an American fairy tale, definitely connects it in with the fantastic. As you've seen, as I've been reading through the series, you can see the series really connecting to fairy tales, both the Childe Roland fairy tale and then a lot of the myths and legends, those kind of fantastical Arthurian legends, which it does in here as well. It makes mention of Arthur Eld and how Roland sort of descends from Arthur Eld, and how Arthur Eld was the first gunslinger as he rode into battle with his sword Excalibur. So like we're seeing a playing with of a lot of fantasy staples, a lot of fantastic elements. So these videos are super delayed. I definitely read these things when they were supposed to happen. It's just been actually getting these filmed and edited for you guys. So I apologize for the delay. Chat with me about this series, connect with me on Instagram, share your posts with me using the hashtag DTProject17 if you are reading along. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye.